Nebraska football is 100 years old. In its glorious past, we've witnessed legendary coaches, national championships, and Heisman Trophy winners. It's a tradition of winning that only continues through the generations. Nebraska football is also unstoppable tailbacks, elusive quarterbacks. The Cornhuskers are uncompromising, and they are out to commemorate their centennial in style with a third national championship. Colorado shares the same anniversary, but not the same supreme history. Yes, Byron Whizzer White once led them to a perfect season, but now they are pointing at number one for the first time ever at Colorado. The Buffaloes have been through an emotional season. They are focused and explosive, and they have leaped into the national spotlight with an undefeated season. Today, a berth in the Orange Bowl is on the line. It's the Big 8 battle of the year. Nebraska and Colorado coming up next.
Welcome to the Go Big Redcast, the Husker fan sports show with Dave, Honke, Mac, and Boomer.
Welcome to the Go Big Redcast. I'm your host, David Gaspers, and I'm with Honke.
I've had this podcast circled in black and gold for weeks. Let's go!
I'll stop right there. Honke actually just gave it away. This is a special Redcast. We are doing kind of a CUNU rivalry series show here. It's kind of one of our first attempts to do kind of more of a podcast documentary style thing. We're also with producer Skip.
Yo, I'm still waiting for Ralphie to get that red rifle for Christmas so we can shoot his eye out.
That's right. We're gonna try to cover all the bases here with the NUCU series. Looking forward to the game here in Boulder soon. Mac, you want to add anything?
Hope the listeners enjoy us. Trying to put a little perspective on this kind of unique little situation we had between us and our brothers to the west, CU.
And a really special guest we've been able to add to this special Redcast is Tom Shatel. That's right, Tom Shatel of the Omaha World-Herald. It will be on the show here. We've actually pre-recorded an interview. Mac and Honke were able to talk to him a few days ago. And producer Skip will integrate Tom's takes into the show. Hey, Boomer, you joined the Nebraska fandom a little bit later in your life because you started in Texas. Your quick thoughts on CUNU?
Well, I just would like to echo what producer Skip had to say there, and I really hope Ralphie does blow his head off because we need to remount a new Mr. Chip. So if anyone can help with that process, let's get that rolling.
Excellent.
Dang. Wow,
hey, let's
brutal. Out of the gate.
We're fired up here on this. Well, Boomer, let's start there a little bit. Let's give some perspective before we maybe dive into more of our personal memories and recollections about the series. Can you give us a little background on Nebraska, Colorado, historically speaking?
Well, I certainly can. Actually, the history of Nebraska, Colorado, it's kind of an odd history considering the memories a lot of us have or think we have on it. We didn't play each other very much going back to the prehistoric era, or the pre-Devaney eras, really, of Husker football. We played them our first meeting, 1898, and a quick trivia question. Can anyone name me the head coaches of both teams and the team mascots or the team nicknames at that time?
No.
Well, we were probably the Bug Eaters, maybe. Right?
We were the Bug Eaters, I'll give you that one.
And maybe they were the, Golden Spikes or something. I don't know.
You're in the vicinity there, Dave. They originally went by the Colorado Silver and Gold because they had no creativity whatsoever. So that was good.
I love that song.
That's a good question, though. What was the name of our mascot when we were the Bug Eaters? I've never thought about that.
Well, we didn't really have one. They didn't have
a like Herbie
person
the Bug
on the sideline.
The spiders
or
the cicadas.
Yeah. I'm just kidding. And actually, I think a Bug Eater was a bat, if I remember correctly, of some sort. So, but,
Herbie the Love Bug?
Did we win that first game, Boomer?
We did. 23-10. And the coaches at the time were Nebraska was coached by Fielding Yost, who later went on to great fame with Michigan, and Colorado was led by Fred Folsom of Folsom Field fame. So there were some names involved in that first meeting. It was there.
Interesting.
Yeah, it comes full circle. We played a few times after that, and then until about 1907, and then after that, we didn't play. A lot of people kind of forget about it, but Colorado was one of the last teams to join. It was the Big Six and the Big Eight when they joined. I think Oklahoma State had been there under some name and quit and came back later, a little bit after Colorado.
Yeah,
but,
Boomers. To clarify that, so when CU joined, it became the Big Seven. Is that right?
Yeah, because I think Oklahoma State had left by that point, and then
Yeah.
they came back a couple of years later. So,
Right.
However you want to interpret that, are they the last to join, or is Oklahoma State because they came back? However you want to interpret that, and that would have been 1948, and that's really when we started playing them regularly. And actually, Colorado dominated the series from that 1948 until basically 1961. They won the majority of those games. And it was kind of just a different take, I suppose, then. It was our down era, the 40s and 50s, as we've discussed on the podcast in the past. And kind of an interesting just start to the rivalry, or if it is such a thing. And we'll probably cover that later in the podcast, I imagine.
And so then Devaney shows up and everything switches, right?
Yes, it was an abrupt switch at that point. From 62 on, we tended to dominate Colorado. There was the one game in 67 that Colorado managed to win. I don't know how many of our listeners recall that one, but I'm sure there's probably a few of you out there that do. And then we didn't lose to Colorado again until 1986. And I believe some of you guys probably have memories of that game more so than I do.
Yeah. Let's bring Honke in on here, because I want to start with 86 really from our personal recollections. But Honke, you do have some thoughts maybe on some of the 1970s games with CU and some important milestones in the series or rivalry. 71 in particular, where CU finished number 3.
Yeah, I mean, those 18 years where we that's the longest winning streak, obviously, within the rivalry. And during that time in 71, think about this. We talk about how great the SEC West is as a division. Well, the Big Eight in 1971, 8 teams finished at the end of the year, number 1, number 2, and number 3, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Colorado. Of course, that's the year of the game of the century, but not to be forgotten is Colorado finishing number 3 that year. They went undefeated outside of playing Nebraska and Oklahoma. Those are the only 2 losses they had. In non-conference, they beat number 9 LSU and they beat number 6 Ohio State. So that was a very good CU team, probably as good as they had ever in their history up until that point. But they were going up against 2 juggernauts with the Sooners and the Huskers.
Can you imagine Boulder in 1971 with the number 3 team in the country? Peace, love,
No, I really can't.
and football.
Fast forward to 1978, and Osborne beats Oklahoma for the first time, gets that big monkey off his back, and then loses to Missouri. We end up playing Oklahoma in the bowl game right afterwards, which is a real kick in the gut. And after that season, we lose to Oklahoma. After that season, the only time during his 25 years at Nebraska, he interviewed outside of the state. He interviewed at Colorado, and he was close to taking the job. Flying back to Lincoln, he thought about it. He prayed on it, did all the things that Osborne would do, and decided he couldn't do it to his players. He couldn't go back and tell the guys that he had recruited and said that he wanted them to be here for 4 or 5 years. He couldn't go and leave them. But that was the only time that he almost left was to Colorado. Then we get to 83, and that's the first game I really remember. The 83 season, we're talking scoring explosion, Rozier, Gill, all those guys. And I remember a game at halftime that was kind of close, biting fingernails, 14-12. And then we scored 48 points in the third quarter, and that kind of ended that.
So, Honk, right before then, Bill McCartney took over the CU program in 82. Does that sound correct?
Sounds right, yep.
And so the story goes, if you will, that, McCartney, who's a Michigan man, he was an assistant at Michigan, gets hired at CU, and one of his first questions is like, who's your rival? And they really didn't have one. And so he circled Nebraska and put a target on that game. And some of his assistant coaches, like Jerry DiNardo, talk about these stories. They're not quite sure why it was Nebraska, but the geographic proximity and the fact that he respected how Osborne ran that program are maybe 2 of the reasons that McCartney chose that. But ultimately, it took a few years until he built up CU to be more competitive. And Honke, you remember 1986 well, I presume.
Yeah, so that kind of takes us to the end of that 18-year streak, and that's the 86 game. I can remember being outside, I'm shooting hoops, listening to the game on the radio because it wasn't televised. And
Netflix didn't carry it? What is this world?
The internet service was down.
What is this world
then.
you're describing?
So Nebraska lost 20-10, and I can just recall as the game was going on, and when it finally started to be real, like late third quarter, fourth quarter, I can still remember being outside and just like, this is impossible. There's no way we can lose to a conference team that's not Oklahoma, because in my memory, at that point, I was born in 1977, and up until that point, I don't recall us ever losing to a Big 8 conference team that wasn't Oklahoma, because it didn't happen in my memory.
You don't recall it because it didn't happen, exactly.
Yeah, I think we lost to Missouri in 1978, but I was a year old, so that's what it was like back then. There was that much dominance. We just never lost to anyone else.
Yeah, I agree. The 86 game is galvanized in my mind because of that. I remember listening to that game on the radio in my basement of my house with my dad in his workshop. And it was just one of those Saturdays where we're just going to listen to the Nebraska game. They're going to win by 4 touchdowns. And, when's that Oklahoma game come up? Right. And, it just never, we were down and we just never could come back. Let's hear Tom's take on Bill McCartney starting the NU-CU rivalry.
Because 86. They upset Nebraska there, and it was like, I remember covering the Big 8 going, whoa, and I don't think anybody saw that coming.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was sort of the beginning of this Colorado-Nebraska thing that I really don't like very much. I'm not going to Boulder, and I'm really not that sad about it. I love Folsom Field, but I don't like the atmosphere around the game. I just think it's not about football. It's not even about rivalry. It's just about being mean.
Well, Mac, do you remember that by chance when you were a kid?
Actually, Dave, I don't really remember that game at all. 86 was a little early for my fandom. I did have a small spell in my life where I was in Iowa. I don't want to talk about that. But
I thought I knew you.
Yeah. Well, it's not something I go tell people, Mike.
Well, you're from Texas.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's
Jeez,
not my fault.
All of our faults, Boomer. Back off. No, but the first game that really is kind of crystallized in my mind was the one with Eric Bieniemy and just our inability to tackle his thighs.
I've gone to several CU NU games, and Skip, you can jump into here pretty soon, because I think this is starting to get into your personal memory of NU CU, and you have a very intimate relationship with this series because of living out here in Colorado. I remember I went to the 88 game, I believe, where we won 7-0. It was an ugly game, and Steve Taylor scored a touchdown. And then 89 is when we lost to him for the second time, if I remember right. Honke, Boomer, correct me.
Yep,
wrong on that one, in Boulder. And then in 90 was the game where we were up 12-0. Eric Bieniemy had 4 fumbles, I believe, in the first half. Does that sound right, guys? Mm-hmm. And then had 4 touchdowns in the fourth quarter to kind of overcome that. And that took, CU they're playing for the national title at the end of those years, actually.
Yeah, that's probably that first year that really crystallized my extreme dislike of Colorado, I guess, if you want to put it that way. That whole 1990 year, they won that game, and then they got their national title that season, and
with the 5th down.
Yeah, with the 5th down, with the phantom clip in their bowl game against Notre Dame, when Rakib Ishmael was returning that kick or punt, if I remember correctly, and they called it back on just a terrible call. I mean, how many things had to go Colorado's way to win a national title that year? And really, they probably shouldn't have won it over Georgia Tech anyway. But yeah, that year was probably the one that really started crystallizing Colorado dislike for me for a transplant to Nebraska.
Skip?
Well, I transplanted to Colorado from Nebraska in 87. I do remember watching that 7-0 victory. The next year, as a 9-year-old, I went to the game in Folsom, where it was the number 2 ranked and number 3 ranked teams in the country. Where Nebraska lost 21-27, and I vividly remember so many parts of that game. I was in the south stands, getting yelled at. They served beer at Folsom back then before a long, long ban. I remember going into the restroom and, as a young boy, seeing lines to pee in the sinks. Not just the urinals in the bathrooms, being like, what is this? Then it was really the biggest game of McCartney's career up to that point, and really kicked off a long, legitimate run of top 20, top 15 games between CU and Nebraska. And to me, it was on after that. Like, as a boy living in Colorado, CU was on top of the world. They're going to the Orange Bowl. That was the grease on the fire from a kid living out here and seeing that type of fandom explode. It was heated.
But Skip, let's talk about that for a little bit. I think that's really important because this is when, if you're a CU fan or a Nebraska fan and you do consider this a rivalry, this is when that really came to be, right? The games are closely contested, highly ranked teams. They were really being played for something.
Yeah, and they're happening late in the year, as well. Like they're happening in November.
Yeah.
These games were deciding the Big 8 championship if you go back and watch it. And I did go back and watch recently that game. God bless YouTube. Everything is available. You can listen to these game calls, and it's insane. And they were starting, as that game is winding down, even though Nebraska's making a drive, I believe it was on ABC, the announcer's like,
Folks in Colorado, get ready to call for reservations to Miami.
I mean, it was deciding the Big 8, how many of those years, from that year to the next 10.
So, Honke, this is a good point of context here. This is right when Oklahoma was falling off, right? Barry Switzer retires in 88, if I remember right, or so.
Yep.
And CU does momentarily clearly replace OU as NU's prime competition for the Big 8 title.
Yeah, we had multiple games with them during about a 5 to 6 year stretch. Right as Switzer's leaving Oklahoma, we have about 2 or 3 games with Colorado where we're both ranked in the top 10, maybe 3 or 4 games even. I mean, there were some really highly ranked games, and these games didn't just mean something for the conference. They meant something nationally. They were the national game of the week when we would play Colorado. And so that's the difference maker between Colorado and the Missouris and K-States and even Iowas, the teams that have been kind of our new border rivals that have tried to become the next Oklahoma rivalry since. Colorado actually ascended to a level that all those other ones really didn't. At least, I guess I'd also say at the same time that we were at that level too. So, I mean, we had major...
Its timing is important.
Yes. I mean, we have to do our part, right, to be a rivalry too. And so both of us, Colorado and Nebraska, were both hot at the same time in those late 80s, early 90 time period.
I can give you those stats if you want. From 88 to 96, in those 9 years, both Colorado and Nebraska were top 20 in every matchup. 7 times they were top 15, 6 times they were top 10, and 3 times they were top 5 over that 9-year stretch. That's insane. Every one of those games in 9 years was at least minimum a top 20 matchup.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's where the series really hit its peak. And Colorado had the best of Nebraska a few times. And we've already mentioned them winning in 89 and 90. And then we tied 19-19, I believe, in 91. Is that right, Honke?
Yeah, the famous snowball game.
Here's Tom Shatel's take.
And I did not really experience it until the first Orange Bowl that I covered in Omaha. They ended up tying Colorado in 91 out there. Colorado, it was snowing all week. We barely got out there because of it was a blizzard all through Nebraska. The team had to go in there early. We get out there, and the fans are snow all over Folsom Field, and they're throwing snowballs at Byron Bennett, the kicker, as he's lining up to try to win the game. Of course, he misses because he's getting pelted by snowballs, which was total classless. It was, if you weren't involved in the game, you go, come on, guys.
And then in 92, you recall 1992, guys.
Yeah,
how did that game go?
That's one of my favorite memories growing up. It was Halloween. My dad took me to the game, and it was kind of rainy out and just a good old, late October game in Lincoln. But it's Frazier's really coming out party as a true freshman. Travis Hill had a big play early in the game.
And Detmer in and out of the hands, and it's intercepted on the opening play of the game by Travis Hill.
That kind of started things off, and we beat them 52-7. Just
both oddly ranked number 8 going into that game.
Oh, yeah.
And so after that game, we blow them out, and we go on that night. My dad takes me to a volleyball game that we watched, and then at midnight, they had Midnight Madness for basketball. Danny Nee, it was the start of the basketball season, the first practice that night, and that's Piatkowski and that kind of era of players. So it was just this really cool day, but it all started with absolutely destroying Colorado. which was just great. And then we don't lose again to Colorado until a game in 01.
So, Honke, was that your first NUCU game that you actually saw in person?
My first one was in 90, and that was a horrible, rainy, terrible day too. And as you mentioned, Dave, we were up 12-0 going into the fourth quarter, and Mickey Joseph was our quarterback, and the weather was so crappy, and the ball was so slippery, and Joseph, I can just remember the guy's tiny. I mean, his hands were small. He couldn't hold on to the ball, in the fourth quarter, and then that's when the enemy went nuts. And Darian Hagan was our quarterback.
Mac, have you been to a NUCU game before?
Yeah, I went to one in 08. Yeah, and that's the first one that I can recall. I've been to Folsom Field, but only for a Dave Matthews concert, and the seats sucked. Screw you, CU.
All right, well, we'll get to that 08 memory in a little bit, but I do want to keep it in the 90s here just a bit longer, because even so, we lost a few games there versus CU, and then we started to go on a winning streak. Honke, you want to jump in?
Well, the first game that I ever watched with Mac on TV was in 94, and it was an early morning national televised game. Number 2 versus number 3. Colorado comes to Lincoln. It's the 200th sellout of Memorial Stadium, and it's the Brook Berringer starting game. I mean, and there was all kinds of concerns going into that, and that was the incredible Colorado offense that had
Michael Westbrook.
Well, Salam ends up winning.
That was Rashawn Salam versus Lawrence Phillips.
Yeah.
Yes, and Salam wins the Heisman, and you got Cordell Stewart, and you've got Westbrook. You have the tight end is Christian Fourier. Yeah. This incredible
Chad
offense.
Johnson, wasn't he on the linebacker for the?
But what really stuck out is the black shirts play that day. Nebraska wins 24-7. I think we were up 24-0 actually. So Colorado scores the last touchdown of the game. But the defense, I don't have the stats in front of me, but it was an insane third down and fourth down defense against Colorado. I think I'm just making it up right now. They got like 1 out of like 15 or 20 third and fourth downs combined. It was insane how the defense shut that offense down, and there was a ton of pro players on that. And one kind of, I guess, side note that was kind of cool out of it was something that Rob Zaska mentioned on a BTN show.
94 Colorado game. Before the game, I made up a story, told it just to the starting offensive lineman, that Shannon Clavel, Colorado's starting and star defensive tackle, got off the charter flight carrying a pipe cutter to signify that they were going to cut through the Nebraska pipeline, the nickname our offensive line had. And I told that to the offensive line. A lot of the guys got awfully fired up about it. Best part of it, though, I always thought, was walking through the locker room after the game. The press interviews are wrapping up, and I still heard 2 or 3 offensive linemen on the team talking about how, with their defensive line carrying a pipe cutter off of the plane, that was something that really served to motivate them to go out and really just put this absolutely dominating performance on Colorado that day. But it was a completely made-up story.
That was around the same time that our players would start wearing the opposing team's hats and stuff to press conferences the week of the game, like to keep focus on what's going on that week.
If I remember that year correctly, that's the one where Tommy Frazier was in street clothes, suffering from blood clots, and then Berringer had a collapsed lung. So all the games leading up to it was like, is anyone going to be healthy to play CU? I mean, they're a top 5 team. They're coming in number 2. Like, that was a huge story of who's going to play and can any of them perform. And then we go out there and do that.
Yeah, and for Brook to perform the way he did, which was he brought a different offense from what Frazier brought. He could complete 60+% of his passes. The first touchdown, I think, of the game, if I remember right, was the perfect pass over the shoulder of Eric Alford. Yeah. And there's kind of the famous, there's a still frame of him, going into the end zone as he's got the arms up in the air with the ball. And Brook, that offense changed mid-season with Frazier out, no doubt. But Brook was at his absolute best in that game against Colorado. That was a thing of beauty to watch.
Yeah, I think it gave people the confidence of, I think we can win the national championship with either quarterback. Mm-hmm. Not just like, Tommy's out, let's get by.
Skip, that's exactly where I wanted to go, actually, because that's my memory of that game, is watching that game. And Honke, I remember we were up 24-0, and there was a lot of doubt going into that game and how good we were, and And if you recall, we're very close to the previous year, losing in the Orange Bowl to Florida State 18-16, but with all the injuries and other things, it wasn't really clear. And then we just came out and we just absolutely dominated that game. And my personal recollection was, we're going to do this. We can do this. We're going to compete for the national title this year. And that's a special moment in someone's memory when you think suddenly the team that you've rooted for so long for can really get to the pinnacle of the game. And that was the game for me where I'm like, I think we can win it this year.
That's how good Colorado was at that time.
That was 2 versus 3. The next year was 2 versus 7. The next year was 4 versus 5. I mean,
that was McCartney's last team. And I've heard this many times before. They feel like that 94 team stacked with NFL talent was McCartney's best team. And we absolutely took him to the woodshed.
That's the team that won on the Hail Mary at Michigan earlier in the year. That was the same day that Nebraska beat Wyoming, where Berringer collapsed his lung. But I remember hearing about, hey, Cordell throws this 70-yard bomb, and Colorado's on a roll. It was a team of destiny for Colorado. They caught the Hail Mary, and so they're going to come into Lincoln on our 200th consecutive sellout and win it.
I think they'd beat Texas by a last-second field goal as well. Yeah, it was definitely a team of destiny rolling in there.
So in 95, our freshman year in college for the Redcast.
So you guys probably don't remember any of that game. Is that what you're saying?
Well, Honke and myself and our friend Travis actually got tickets to go to this game in Folsom. And so we actually traveled out to Boulder. And, Honke, we obviously wanted to have a good time beforehand. And so we ended up waiting in line as the game began.
Yeah, it was so stupid that we didn't get our tickets from the lottery driving down there. You had to pick them up at the stadium. And we lucked out the morning of the game because we drove into Boulder without any place to stay.
Good planning. Yeah.
Well, we weren't 21 yet, let's be honest. And our buddy Travis actually had his mom secure us a hotel room, but they required you to be 21. So when we got to Boulder, they're like, no, you can't check in. And Honke, in his very resourceful self, was able to find us. I think it was a Best Western, if I recall.
That sounds
very
like
nice
me.
accommodations.
And it sounds like Best Western, just throwing rules to the wind. Yeah.
They're like, sure, we'll take you 3, no problem.
And what I recall was, we were basically across the street, not far from the stadium at all. We could see the stadium from our room, which was nuts. It was an early game. It was maybe a 1:00 game or something like that. And so we got into our room. We turned on ESPN, the game day.
And the starting lineup, backs and receivers for Phillies. You've got Amon Green. Get used to the name, folks. He's only a freshman. And he is terrific. He's going to be around a good long time. First down for Nebraska. The ball is at the 43 after the short punt. And here goes Frazier down the line, delivers the ball to Green. Green's on the corner, going down the sidelines. He's on his way. He's got a touchdown. 57 yards.
They knew it was coming, and they still couldn't stop it.
And so sure enough, Honke and I miss Amon Green around the left end for a touchdown. Mac, I mean, you probably saw that on TV, I presume?
It was a newly designed play for that game, actually.
Yeah,
Osborne had just written it up that week, and it was worked to perfection.
Different formation. It was basically two split ends, and then they did it out of a power eye backfield. So it's something that was drawn up specifically for that play. They hadn't run that exact kind of formation, that kind of play before, and
Brendan Holbein was out.
Seemed like it's just an option play, though. I mean,
I know.
It's like, they're never going to be ready for this.
Green was so fast. Like, he gets around the corner and like, oh, that's good for a first down. And he just runs by 3 CU defensive backs, just clears them. Like, you think he's getting pushed out of bounds at about 12-yard gain. When you rewatch that play, it is insane how he just blows by everybody. And it even surprised Keith Jackson on that call. He's just kind of like...
Yeah, yeah, it was exactly that. And I wish I would have saw it.
And I have to say, we had Keith Jackson doing multiple games in a row. I was going to mention it when we were talking about 94, but it was, when I think of Keith Jackson and Nebraska, I think actually of Colorado more now, because there were so many times where it'd be like, his pregame thing, he'd be talking about Nebraska coming across the bumbling, stumbling across the plains to play the Buffaloes from the Rockies. And, he had this whole thing. And
Today, the unbeaten Colorado Buffaloes are thundering across the plains to take on the undefeated Nebraska Cornhuskers. So it reminds me of that old Roger Miller lyric, you can't roll escape the Buffalo herd. Well, I would suggest to you that the Cornhuskers intend to find out. Bob Greasy for the X's and O's and a more.
God bless Keith Jackson, man.
that is awesome.
Man, that's Keith Jackson in
Absolute
to a T.
classic.
Perfect.
So, of course, Dave and I, and Travis, we missed that first play. But when we finally got to our seats, we realized that we were up 7-0, so that was good. But our seats were weird because all of the seats, like literally 99% of the seats that were in that lottery, all were in the corner of the field, and that's where all these Nebraska fans were. And somehow our 3 seats were at like the 40-yard line, 4 rows up, like right behind the Nebraska bench. I could yell at Jesse Cush, which I did, and he was on my team at Scotus, so he knew me, and he never really had to punt ever back then much. And so I could yell at him. He turned around, he waved at us. That was fun. But my memory...
Focus on the game, Jesse.
But my memory, as much as anything, Dave, was sitting behind these Broncos fans. And I'm calling them Broncos fans because I don't really think they were Buffalo fans. They were just there for the day. They didn't really care. They had hot damn in their like pockets. And anytime Nebraska scored, they would just pull out hot damn, and we were all drinking it. And I could never really tell if they were rooting for us or Colorado. They were really cool.
They were rooting for touchdowns.
They were just
they
rooting.
Well, they
just
were
rooting for hot damn.
The game was a blowout.
Hot damn sales reps.
Well, it worked. It was a blowout, and so these guys clearly did not care about. I mean, honestly,
Can I make a quick show note? For those of you young Redcasters, hot damn is like the old person version of Fireball whiskey.
That's a great distinction, Skip. That's a good job.
Okay, now I do have. So, I'm going to ask this to Mac real quick. Trivia: What's the play you remember from that Nebraska-Colorado game in '95?
When Tommy Frazier got blitzed from a blind side, clear shot on him. Guy hits him. Tommy looks at him, and then still throws the ball to strike them on green up the sideline.
Yeah, never got sacked. It was amazing. Never got sacked.
I've never seen a quarterback take a hit from a full-on blitzing. I can't remember if it was a corner or safety. It doesn't really matter. They were playing defense.
Yep.
You hit a quarterback who wasn't looking. He stood there, and it's Tommy Frazier, not the best passer in the world, and he completed the ball on you. It was like, it's going to be a good day.
Never got sacked the whole season, but he clearly should have been on that play. But anyways, I knew Mac would know the answer to that.
Here's Tom's take on Tommy Frazier in the 1995 CU game.
Yeah, Nebraska 95 had to play a perfect game, no penalties, to win out there. And Tommy Frazier would tell you his favorite play was not the run in the Fiesta Bowl against Florida. He doesn't like that play because Florida gave up. He's told me that. He said that the Gators, those guys weren't. They gave up. He didn't respect that play at all. I mean, he's known for it, but his favorite play, and I remembered it.
I know where you're going with this, Tom. I know which one it is.
It was a third down pass, Amon Green.
Yep.
For a first down, a very important drive, and he was getting hit. He was actually getting leveled by I don't know if it was Ted Johnson or some Colorado linebacker, Matt Russell or somebody was all over him, and he held the ball and I completed the pass as he was being sacked.
Yeah,
and he said that's his favorite play.
I've never seen a quarterback take a blindside shot like that. And it looked like he looked down at the guy hitting him. He's like, well, I'm going to throw it anyway. And still complete it, and then I'll go down. It was such a strong play. I mean, it's about as good as that picture of the charging buffalo and Osborne just pointing the other way.
Right.
That's a good one. My memory of that, Honke, and I remember the fans in front of us was, since it was a blowout, and there was beer being still served in Folsom at that point, they were betting there was a few other Nebraska fans around us, and they were betting on whether, are you going to get a first down here or not? Essentially, every play was a bet between these guys because it was an absolute blowout, and it was just like money being passed back and forth and beers being swapped. And that's actually a very fond memory of whether they're true CU fans or not. We'll probably have a discussion here about some of the less friendly moments between fans, but that was, to me, a great experience, and it was a great time.
So the first year, it finally became one team not ranked. Nebraska was 2, Colorado was unranked in 1997, and Colorado was not ranked in the next 3 years either. But despite that, every game was decided by 3 points or less.
Yeah, I remember that 96 game in Lincoln. That was very cold, if I remember correctly, and we had jumped out to a pretty early lead in that game, and then that second half, we couldn't do anything right, it seemed. We fumbled the ball. I think the quarterback was some guy, Frost. Is that how you pronounce the name, if I remember right? Yeah, he'd fumbled a couple times. D'Angelo Evans, I recall fumbling. And I think in Nebraska territory multiple times, and the defense really rose up in that game to keep the Buffaloes out.
Yeah, in 97, that's the Scott Frost, we're going to win the national title. And we were up 27-10 going into the fourth quarter, and Colorado puts on 14 points. They got a onside kick on us. I mean, we had to make a last-second stop on a fourth down, or there was a chance this game could, end up going into overtime or losing. And that was, the week right before we went and played in the Big 12 title game and destroyed A&M. Yeah, in 99, another one to producer Skip's point there, it's our first ever overtime game for Nebraska. And we win 33-30.
Nebraska team.
And honestly, that was really close to not being overtime, because if I remember, Colorado had a shot at like a straight-on field goal with no time left in that game, because they had some crazy rally in the fourth quarter to even tie it up, and they just shanked it, thankfully.
And I think that was the game too. Solich was going nuts on the sideline, and defensive coordinator Craig Bohl tried to kind of just calm him down a little bit, and Solich kind of, there was like a little, it wasn't Pelini-like, but it was kind of like there was a sideline, discussion between the two. But anyway.
Which had never been seen. I mean, Osborne, never had that, so that's a good point.
I got a question for all you Nebraskans. So in 96, this game moved to the day after Thanksgiving. What did everybody in Nebraska feel about that?
That's a good question, Skip. I feel like since Oklahoma had been down since really the late 80s there, I think there was a natural transition to CU being a more prominent game on the schedule. With that said, that change in timing was a direct result of the Big 12 and of Oklahoma moving to the South Division and us not playing every single year. So I think there was always a hope in my mind that Oklahoma would come back, or an expectation at some point that Oklahoma would come back and that rivalry would resume. And so a little bittersweet in my opinion, in the sense that I felt like CU was a natural team to take that position because of what was forced upon us. But at the same time, it was this realization that we weren't going to be playing Oklahoma every year at the same time. Let's hear Tom's take on the CU rivalry.
Colorado was like, I'm going to go up to the big bully and pick a fight. And you have to take the bully down to get his attention. And while they did, they won in 89 and 90. And that was it, right? Until 2001, they didn't win.
Yeah, I think the fact that Colorado, to your point there, Skip, about in 97, starting to not be ranked anymore, that started to have a negative effect on that feeling of that game after Thanksgiving too. I mean, that was the big thing about the Friday after Thanksgiving. We were playing a big game against Oklahoma or whoever it was, and it was always a game that had all this meaning, and all of a sudden we start playing games where the teams aren't ranked, and eventually it got to the point where we weren't ranked, and I think that's had as much of effect on it as anything, as opposed to just whoever the team is that we're playing. I mean, if Nebraska gets back to where we want Nebraska to be, and we're a top 5 and top 10 team routinely at that point, that already is going to play a big role in making that game feel big again, whoever we're playing afterwards. But when the opponent's up there too, man, that's a magical moment when you can get both of them going. And Colorado stopped being that team, even though we still were. We still were in 97 and 98 and 99, but Colorado wasn't. And it starts to become just another game on your schedule. And I know this kind of gets into the rivalry thing, and was it a rivalry or wasn't it? But when Colorado didn't keep up its end of the bargain, so to speak, and that really started under Neuheisel right away, man. They they started to drop off fairly quickly a year or two after McCartney was done. And Nebraska was still good. I mean, we were good well up until 2001.
The day the music died.
The day the music died, which was at the hands of Colorado. But when they started to fall off, that game it didn't have that same feeling, even though the games were really good. They were, settled within 3 points or less.
Mm-hmm. And then it flipped, right? I mean, 2001 is a flipping point or tipping point in this story. Yep. And it's not one that we like to talk about. Honke, you were there at that game. And there was moments, I remember in the second half.
2001?
2001, where...
Oh, Honke, you were there too?
I was.
Yeah,
I
Skip
was there.
as well.
Oh, me and you both, buddy.
And
He was the one all in red.
I remember watching that game, and I think we had a chance to take it within one touchdown sometime in the third quarter, and I can't remember. I think it was a fumble or something sort of deep in the red zone, and we lost the ball, and we never got much closer. But
we're 11-0 in that game. We are number 1 in the country. Eric Crouch was just on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And, all the things in the world are going well. And I got into that game, and we had been throwing back a few brews before the game, and some of the fans were not very kind to us beforehand. They didn't want to tailgate with us, and we found these cool Colorado fans that would. So I threw back beers with them. And my uncle, who I was with, and at that time my younger cousin, it was time to walk to the game, and I'm like, well, I'm going to stay back. I'm going to throw back a few more with these really cool Buffalo fans. And we're throwing them back, and then when I finally get to our seats, which were in the CU student section, I'm wearing red from head to toe, and I'm walking in front of all of them, and they are throwing stuff at me and booing me and everything. And I raised my fingers to tell them what number we were. We were number 1 in the country, so I was letting them know we were number 1. And then I go and I sit down, and then we're down 28-0 at the end of the first quarter, and I have to walk back in front of all those students again to go to the only restroom that was in the entire section of Folsom Field because it was built in 1912 or whatever. And so I have to walk back in front of all of them, and then they were throwing everything, every bottle or whatever they brought with them at me.
Did you add the thumb and tell him you're number 2 now?
I was like, I deserve it. Ooh, that one hurt. Hey, that one hit the head. That was a good throw. Hey, I was like,
that's not beer.
I deserved it. I get it, but
I deserved it. I was there.
That game though. I mean, it just, you watch it, and of course, but it was the brilliant mind of Sean Watson. I'm like, if we could only get him to one day be our OC, but how could that even possibly happen?
He sprung this new play on us called a trap.
I talked with Sean Watson. This was back when he was Bill Callahan's right-hand man, the coordinator, whatever. We were just chatting one day at practice, and I said, Sean, you were at Colorado in 01. I said, what happened in that game? Can you explain to me how that happened?
It was brutal.
I mean, it was Chris Brown every play and going for 20 yards, and the tight end open every play. I said, how in the world? I mean, that was a good Nebraska team. They beat Oklahoma. They were ranked in the top 2 or 3. I think they were 2 or something like that. Maybe they were number 1. I don't remember. But he said he goes. It's a great story. He said Gary Barnett was the head coach, and for the previous 3 or 4 years, he said it drove him crazy that he couldn't beat Nebraska. So he said that Barnett, for the previous 3 years, spent every day on Nebraska. He spent part of every day on Nebraska, where he would study. He'd break down their film. He would look at something, what they did last year, their schemes, their personnel. And he said for like 3 years in a row. And sure enough, and he's right. 99, Nebraska, I think, won in overtime out there. They almost lost. Mm-hmm. And then the 99 team won the Big 12. Well, they were going to blow that. They hadn't won that game. So that was close. And then the next year, I think Josh Brown had to hit a field goal at the buzzer to beat Colorado in Lincoln. Mm-hmm. So every year they got closer. And then Sean said in 2001 the dam broke. He said they just had them pegged perfectly.
Well, Mac, I think you said it the right way. That was the day the music died for Nebraska.
Yeah.
And it becomes why this week is so important in Boulder, is that this week is the chance, I like to think, to get that back. our mojo ended in Boulder, and I want our mojo to start again on Saturday.
Poetic, man. I like that.
Seriously. And this is the start of getting that mojo back. Dave, you've been to every single away loss you could possibly be to. The last away win you've been to was 95 at Colorado.
Thanks,
right? Am I right?
Oh, Dave, this is full circle.
The last win I've seen was Nebraska at Folsom Field in 1995.
On the road.
On the road, correct.
So this is a chance. That's why this week is so important. It's one of the reasons we wanted to kind of throw all this together, is to talk about how, Colorado, from a rivalry standpoint, I'll never put them in the Oklahoma category or anything like that, but they have played an integral part in Nebraska's history, certainly the recent history. That game has meant something, and that game, that 0-1 game specifically, boy, it took the wind out of the sails of everything that was Nebraska football for 40 years.
Yeah, Mac or Skip, maybe jump on this one. In the sense, I was reading some CU message boards, just kind of like seeing how much hatred is still out there for Nebraska, and for at least a very select amount of CU fans, it's still very real. And that 62-36 is really just
is the badge of honor for
badge of honor. That's a good description, Skip. They hold that with great pride. That they brought down the Nebraska dynasty, more so than some of the great games they had in the late 80s, early 90s that actually had real consequences for them to advance to a national title game. For goodness sakes. Why do you think that is? Skip, you've lived through this very close geographic proximity of all these CU fans. Why is it that game, or why do they see this as more of a rivalry than maybe Nebraska fans do?
I think they felt like little brother for 9 straight years. There's even a game broadcast I went back and re-listened to.
A big rivalry for Colorado. Nebraska would dispute that, but here come the Buffalo.
The Buffs consider Nebraska their biggest rivals, and Nebraska really doesn't really give a lot of credence to that. I mean, Keith Jackson's saying this on the air, and how do you feel when you're still the top 10 team in the nation?
Yeah.
With a bordering state, and they won't recognize you. After you just beat them, or you tied them, and then you beat them 2 years before that. In the same intro broadcast, it says,
all right, the last team to beat Colorado in Big 8 play, you guessed it, Nebraska.
Yeah,
Nebraska's
that's exactly
still
right. And
considering, we don't really consider you a rival. Well, you haven't beat them in 4 years, since 88, and this is 92. You get that little brother complex, and I can be an expert at that because I went to CSU, and CU treated us the same way when I started going there, and we started beating them. And we were starting to split the series 50-50 many games, there was a 9-year stretch. We were 5-4, and they don't consider us a rival. Even though we're in state, I get that we're not in the same conference and we have to play them at the beginning of the year. A lot of those dynamics are different, but I could see where Colorado always gets that inferiority complex. They don't feel like they were given their due from 89 to 91.
I can agree with that.
Because 92 to 2000 happened, even though they were close so many damn times. All you guys could say is, you can't beat us. Who cares? This is why we're not a rival. And then they come out there and smoke you when you're the number 1 team in the country. And that is why it was like, finally you give us some credit. Yeah. Like, we've done it. We've slayed the dragon. Game of Thrones over.
Yes. we have had
nobody liked how Game of Thrones ended.
Post Oklahoma, as a rival, Nebraska's had a history of any time a team beats us once or twice, they become and they happen to be a border school, they immediately become our rival. So we've seen it with Mizzou, we've seen it with K-State, we've seen it with Colorado, now we're seeing it with Iowa. The difference, though, and I think you've hit on it perfectly, Skip, is that Colorado sustained it a little bit longer, but they had some very meaningful years, those late 80s, early 91s, where they were top 5, top 10 when they were playing us. And then when they beat us big, and I know we've lost big to Missouri, we lost big to K-State, we've lost big to Iowa during this time. But when we lost big to Colorado and we were number 1 in the country and 11-0 and had the Heisman Trophy candidate at quarterback, that's exactly to your point. Like, Colorado, they've never been at Oklahoma's level with us. They've never been that kind of rivalry. But I would say they were the one that ascended to the second highest more than any of the other schools I just mentioned, Iowa, Missouri, K-State.
So let me ask Mac on that because he has some K-State relations, right? Mm-hmm. K-State had a run there in the late 90s and early 2000s where they probably won
3 or 4.
3 of 4, right? Yeah. And do you feel like, and if we were having this, if we were playing K-State in 25-26 here, and we suddenly want to have a K-State show,
Border War, Nebraska, K-State.
How would the K-State fans, think of Nebraska? They'd probably think of them as a rival, right? Yeah. Based off of maybe a 3 or 4 year stretch almost.
Yeah, that's interesting. They may. I mean, I'm kind of with you on that, Honk. I found that whole upswell of the lack of the Oklahoma as a true rival, or at least them being very relevant when we were good in the 90s. And that's kind of when I started really watching. I mean, for one, the games got to be on TV, and for two, we never went to games in Lincoln or anywhere. So that's how I got to see them. So for me, Colorado made sense being that replacement rivalry, but when it was Missouri, when it was K-State, I found that so much more irritating. I'm like, you've never won anything. I mean, at least Colorado had split a national championship, and they'd have really good players, go through their program and go to the NFL. So it was like the
Heisman.
Yeah, so it's like, well, this feels more like it to me, but the K-State and the Mizzous of the world, I'm like, it's irritating. It's just they were just more irritating. But yeah. Colorado, to me, I guess, in my fandom and just the way the genesis of how it worked for me, Colorado kind of was my rival as a young fan. And I saw that as a game that was never to be taken lightly. And to your point, Skip, even when they weren't ranked and they'd play us down to the wire, that never surprised me. It was never a game I just struck as a win right away this season, Whereas K-State, I would.
Yeah.
In 89, 90, when those games were happening, the winner was going to the national championship game or was playing for the national championship.
Yeah.
So they were not getting that respect in 89, 90, winning and playing for that. And so I feel like it was just that stuff brushed under the rug, finally coming out 10 years later that they weren't getting that respect and they're just blowing up at their step parents,
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. The Keith Jackson call, for example, and everything. It's just
that came years after Colorado would beat them and play for the national championship, and Nebraska's not considering them anything.
Yeah, for Honke,
and maybe that was strategy by Osborne, tongue in cheek. It could have been any of that, to not want to give McCartney what McCartney wants. That was probably diabolical by Osborne to be doing that, and I get that, but that fueled the fire here, and it did not just for the team, it did for the Denver media, it did for all of
Woody
that.
Page.
It became that game became the biggest ticket in town, the biggest regular season game of the year in a 4-sport major town, and that has not been replaced since. I've never seen that level of craziness and fandom. I've seen it one time, and that's Rocktober 2007 when the Rockies went to the World Series. But it took the Rockies going to the World Series to equal the amount of media this would get outside of a Bronco game or even over a Bronco game than that series got for that hot 12 years.
Why do you think that? I was just going to say, why do you think it is the Nebraska attitude towards rivals? We always say that it always has to be, playing for something meaningful like that, and that's why we've always only considered Oklahoma a rival. Dave and I were talking before the show, if you look at Nebraska, Missouri, that was actually a very competitive series, except for about this 20-year stretch from about 79 to the early 2000s. Missouri actually, played really well against the Devaney and everything. They split the seasons with us going back, to when we first played. Why do you think it is with Nebraska that we would only accept, because you look at other schools, they have rivalries with all sorts of other programs, and you don't always have to be playing for something. I mean, Missouri, Kansas was a rivalry. They never played for anything. Alabama and Auburn are rivals. Granted, they're in state, so that helps.
It meets the check marks, though. They're a border team. Yeah. They're a conference team.
We don't have any. Oklahoma, Nebraska is unique on every level. There's no historical rivalry between the two states. We're not border states. So if people understand the
Trivia time.
Trivia time. Not right as you're getting into that.
Perfect. There's your segue.
So, on that Oklahoma-Colorado trivia note, Colorado and Nebraska both played as a ranked team 15 times. They both played as a top 10 team 8 times. How many times did Oklahoma and Nebraska play as a ranked team? How many times has that happened?
Oh, wow.
When they were both ranked?
When they were both ranked. Top 25.
It's interesting. Back in the 60s, there was only a top 10 for a while, so it was difficult. That might actually impact some of this, but
my note is by being both ranked.
Well, there's 36
Honke?
years of Devaney and Osborne, and I think it's probably safe to say 25 of those probably would qualify. I'm just throwing out a number. And then you go back further into the 30s, where I think the polls started in like 36. So
36.
I don't know. I'm just going to say 28.
I'm going to go lower at 23.
Okay.
I'll go 31. I have no idea.
Let's just go 25 for a random number.
Boomer on the nose.
There you go. How do you like that?
All right, how many of them now were top 10? Both teams in the top 10. Oklahoma versus Nebraska.
Top 10.
I'm going to say a very, very high percentage of those. So I'm going to say
Back
23.
in the 70s, it was, what was that? I'll go lower than that. Okay, like 17.
I'm going to come in at 15.
12.
Dave is closest. It is 18.
18, darn it. So I should have been
18
$1.
Top 10 matchups.
Yeah, it's insane. That is a once in a lifetime rivalry where you can have 18 top 10 matchups.
And
how many other schools? I'd have to do a lot of research.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah,
interesting to
Boomer
find that out.
Could say they've had 18 top 10 matchups.
And that's the thing that people, if they don't understand Nebraska, Oklahoma, they don't understand how good that rivalry was. That was every bit of anything that you'll ever see with Ohio State and Michigan. It had all the historical value. It was two blue bloods going at each other. And the reality is, Nebraska fans get upset when we talk about rivalries, and it's not. We've had a ton of rivalries. We played Kansas 100 straight times in a row. Missouri's a rival. Colorado's a rival. Iowa's a rival. They're border rivals. You can have different types of rivalries, but Husker fans are trying to harken back to playing another Oklahoma, and that's just not going to happen unless Oklahoma joins this conference, or unless Wisconsin and Nebraska become that those two teams that play each other every single year as top 10, top 15 teams. Because I don't see Iowa, and I hate to say this, to the Hawkeye fans there, but I don't see them being up at that level year in and year out. So Frost,
saying it to him.
Nebraska, number one, Frost has to get us back up to that level. And then when we're back up at that level, we have to play somebody every year that is at that level for it to even start to get close to Oklahoma. Now, to Boomer's point earlier, there are all kinds of schools, Oklahoma being one. Who was Oklahoma's number one rival? Was it Nebraska? Was it Texas? Is it Oklahoma State with Bedlam? All kinds of schools have multiple rivalries. Nebraska didn't have anything historical. We didn't have we didn't have a border hatred against Kansas the way Kansas had with Missouri. And I'm talking stuff that happened years before football was around, right? I mean, Lawrence got burned down by people from Missouri. Ohio State and Michigan go back to the War of Toledo. I mean, there are things that have nothing to do with what's going on in the football field that created rivalries. Nebraska has none of that with anybody. We don't have an in-state school that we're rivals with. We don't have any of that stuff that just inherently created one. What I'm getting at is that there's all kinds of rivalries that teams can have, and Nebraska just doesn't have some of that stuff built in. We just don't have that in-state one. We have border schools, but they're not typically ones that we've had major issues
for long
with.
periods of time, Honke, they weren't very good.
Yes.
Right?
So,
whereas the OU-NU thing is purely based off of performance.
Correct.
Right? The two schools were the best schools of the Big Eight for decades.
Yes. It's completely organic. It just created on the football field. There is nothing between the states of Nebraska and Oklahoma off the football field that would have had us being rivals with each other the way Oklahoma is with Texas, right? Oklahoma and Texas have a rivalry, just statehood. Oklahoma.
Well, we did have to wear blue playing Oklahoma once, so maybe we're still bitter about that. I don't know.
You had stopped playing Oklahoma on a regular basis. because the Big 12 had happened and the divisions had happened, right?
Yep.
Correct.
So maybe that is why Colorado felt that need to finally say, now can we please solidify this rivalry with this win? Because you can't even use the we still got Oklahoma excuse anymore every year, because you're not on their calendar every year necessarily.
Yeah.
Whereas you are for Colorado, and maybe that was why there's that feeling.
Again,
Skip, that's a really good thought. Honke, I'm sorry. I think if Nebraska and CU suddenly then had a stretch of 4 or 5 years where we were top 5 or top 10 teams both, that could have really got there.
Bad timing.
It was bad timing.
Yeah, and I think part of that also in the Big 12, our focus had shifted away from, our clashes with Colorado, and Nebraskans really turned their ire towards Texas. And so we did have another object to move our real serious emotions football-wise too, so that probably didn't help either.
Yeah.
But isn't that weird when they're not even in your division?
Well, they may not be in our division, but one thing Nebraska fans looked very highly upon as being blue bloods, and we talk about it all the time, is that we want to play other blue bloods. So Oklahoma, back in the Big 12 North days, you play them every 2 years, but then the off 2 years, you're playing Texas. So every year we were playing a blue blood. It was a different one, and we had this hatred towards the South, that everything was kind of set up against us. We were, it was Nebraska versus the South. And so we kind of always had a blue blood to play, on the other side. Now, again, the whole problem was it didn't even have to do with who the teams we were playing. It wasn't even the rival anymore. We started to have our own infighting coming in 2003 with Solich getting fired. That starts to change everything. And we started losing to K-State. We're losing to Missouri all of a sudden. We lost to Kansas for the first time in 40 years.
Oklahoma State blew us up.
Yeah, so we lost to Iowa State badly. So it just became a point where it's like, I guess anyone that beats us is a rival anymore, and that wasn't getting any Nebraska fan excited. This is the first time since Frost has come back now. This is the first time where I think people really start to feel like we have a chance to be elite again. And now it's going to be about who is that team that's going to match us and be elite again. And I mean, this is a forward-looking thing. It's not talking about Colorado this week, but it's talking about who is that team that's going to match us year in and year out. And I've always said I think it would be Wisconsin most likely out of the West. But point is, it just everything that went on in the 2000s and the early 2010s with the West or with the Big 12 North.
I guess there was a 20-year run where CU did match you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but they
let's pause there. Both ways.
So like from 86 for the first upset through the end of the Big 12, 2010
through 22.
Yeah.
2002,
They didn't match.
Well, no, it's just
they
didn't all the way to 2010.
They didn't match us. If you're telling me they matched us,
the record, the win-loss was, if I remember right, I think we won 17, they won 7, and we tied once. So if 17-7-1 is matching us, sure, yeah, okay.
Yeah, they didn't match us if we're talking about the 90s.
Yes, but like I said, there were how many of those were also 3-point, 2-point, 1-point games? I mean, that's part of a rivalry, right? Like there can be
Michigan hasn't beaten.
There can be a one-sided rivalry if they're close every game.
Michigan's beaten Ohio State one time in the last 15 years. Yeah, it's still a rivalry. I get that. I'm just saying that Nebraska had other things on our mind than whether or not Colorado's our rival as we started getting into the 2000s. I mean, we're starting to lose to everybody for the first time in decades. We have a bunch of what I call second-tier rivals right now. That's the thing. You almost have to rank rivalries. And I think Oklahoma's a good example of this. I think Oklahoma, if you would ask an Oklahoma fan throughout the 80s and 90s and everything, I think they would rank rivalries in Nebraska. And Boomer, maybe you'd be a good person to answer this too, living down in Texas. But I would say they would look at Nebraska and Texas and say maybe 1A and 1B. And then they would say Oklahoma State's, 2. Okay, so that you start to rank them. Right now.
But do you think Oklahoma every year would rather play Nebraska or Texas if you had to give them?
Are you asking today? Or are you asking back?
We gave them their choice.
Yeah, I'm asking. I mean, in perpetuity, if they could only play one of them every year, do you think Oklahoma fans would pick Texas or Nebraska?
Well, they kind of had that choice when the Big 12
they
was
made
formed. They made that choice.
They took the easier choice at the time.
Well, that's
Yeah,
not the
it was-
fans, but
It was a super easy choice in 95 for them to make. But my point is that you can have different types of rivals and different levels of rivals. Nebraska had a number one rival for decades, and pretty much ever since, we just have a series of what I call second-tier rivals. Now, fans, and then it gets into a thing where it's like, well, we don't want to acknowledge Colorado or Iowa or Missouri or K-State because they're not blue bloods like we are, and they're absolutely right. They're not. So we don't acknowledge them as equals, and we don't acknowledge them as a first-tier rivalry, but they're second-tier rivals. I have no problem with that.
So with Shatel's column, he opens with this interesting dialogue between him and a CU reporter or a Colorado-based journalist, and the question was like, so will Nebraska miss the CU rivalry? And Shatel just flatly says no, and the CU reporter kind of is a bit in shock. Do you feel like that's accurate of this type of conversation if it was a Nebraska fan talking to a CU fan and Nebraska fans like, I really don't miss CU? Do CU fans miss Nebraska? Are they happy about being in the Pac-10? Is this something that they've moved on from?
I think CU desperately wants that because there is nothing even close in the Pac-12 that replicates what they had. Even on down years, okay, which they've had a lot of. But even on down years, they would want to end the year or have a game to look forward to like Nebraska, not Utah, which is their designated border war rival that the Pac-12 sent. That does nothing for anybody here. I've never seen anybody get up or the press excited for a Utah game. Even the year that they won their division and went to the Pac-12 championship, it was nothing. It's not even a sniff to what even an average year that didn't even mean they were could win their division against Nebraska would be.
Guys, have you seen?
Do you think?
Have you seen the records of the Pac-12 schools since Colorado and Utah joined? Colorado, out of all 12 teams, by far has the worst conference record against other Pac-12 schools, and it's not close. They've won like
And what's Utah?
They've won like 7.
Utah's pretty good.
Yeah, no, I mean, Colorado's 12 out of 12 in the Pac-12. They've won like 17 games and lost 80. It's something ridiculously stupid. The next closest team to them is Oregon State, who's won like 29 games. So your point there, Dave, or your point there, Skip, and you think about...
I just say if Oregon State had resources, they'd be fine.
Well, but
they have all the Nebraska players that transfer.
Yeah, but Colorado, Colorado's won like 17 games, and one of the seasons was where they actually won their division, and probably, I don't know what exactly their record in conference was, but they would have won 7 or 8,
at least
probably.
6, maybe 7. Yeah.
So
yeah,
they've not had any success in the Pac-12. I'm guessing if you ask Colorado fans, would they like to have that rivalry with Nebraska, or would they like to have a big game with someone? They haven't had much success, period.
So I want to ask you guys this question too, though. Yeah, Dave presented this to me tonight that he doesn't think Colorado would do a redo. They would go to the Pac-12 because they consider themselves a West Coast school and they want to be part of that cool scene of Pac-12. And certainly in basketball, I think they do. But in football, I think they definitely did, but are reconsidering because, hey, how do you say, hey, kids from California and Texas, you want to come play in the Pac-12? Well, come to Colorado. And everyone's like, well, I could also do that in Nike Town, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington, or Southern California, or the Bay Area with 2 teams. It's a harder sell.
That's a good point, Skip.
They could go to the Big Ten and say, hey, come to the Big Ten, but also kind of be in a mountain areas. You're the closest to the West. You have that business differentiator that they don't have in the Pac-12, and maybe they would realize that now. And should the Big Ten want to get, dump Maryland, Purdue could go to the East, and then CU could slide into the West. What are your... I think that's what CU should do from a business decision. They have always fancied themselves as a weird university, as cooler than anyone else. So I don't know if they would ever make the smarter business move, and I think they would get more money in the Big Ten as well.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that, Skip. Yeah, it's Colorado always was kind of that weird position of where do they fit in? Do they, they were always the kind of the hippie Boulder, where Colorado skiing pot kind of area for the Big 12. And they seem to fit better with, the Cals and the California schools at the time, and which is why they probably thought the Pac-12 was a better fit for them. The Big Ten, would they be a great cultural fit there? Probably not, but from a monetary perspective, absolutely, that would be a better move for Colorado to make that jump. Yeah, that would be
an AAU school, Boomer.
Yeah, which is something we can't quite say anymore. Thanks to the rest of the Big 12 or Big 10 for sticking up for us, you jerks. But anyway, that notwithstanding, monetarily wise, it clearly makes more sense to actually join the Big 10 if such an offer was there, because you could actually get their network, as opposed to the Pac-12 network, which might be carried on some North Korean, streaming service, the best I can tell anymore. The way the Pac-12 goes. And you talk about, we've talked about, would it make more sense for the Big Ten to add a school like Colorado rather than Rutgers and Maryland and things like that? And I thought about that, when we talked about doing this show. Colorado does have that Denver market, and it does add something. Rutgers, they do have a big alumni base, and they're comedy gold. We know that. We love making fun of Rutgers, so they bring that. Maryland does offer some media markets as well, kind of like Denver does. And, the one thing Maryland does bring that Colorado doesn't is success in other sports other than football. We know football drives everything, but Colorado doesn't play baseball, so you're basically adding another Wisconsin. Maryland, provides baseball success there, and they're a quality basketball program, and there are some positives to Maryland. So it is tough to say, would it be better to bring in a Colorado rather than any of those two schools?
Hold on. Yeah. Have conferences ever been realigned based on baseball?
No, they have not. No, they haven't. But again, if you're looking at what is Colorado going to bring that Maryland doesn't,
I'll tell you what they're bringing, Boomer.
A rivalry against at least one team, because Maryland brought none of that.
No,
National championships in skiing. That's what CU is bringing to the table.
Hey, Maryland is the lacrosse power, and I don't want to hear about it. No.
So the premise of this, to just give you guys a little bit of background, was that there's an article on from Frank the Tank's Atlanta website. The guy is from Chicago, Big Ten-based guy who's broke a lot of stuff on realignment in the past, and he did an analysis of Big Ten alumni in the top 30 markets of the United States about a year or so ago. And he found out that actually Denver had somewhere between I think it was 1 to 5% of all the alumni out of 10 of the 14 Big Ten schools. They had that many alumni in Denver. So there's a lot of Big Ten alumni in Denver. Honke, you can speak to this because you've been to Denver during a college football Saturday, and you can hop to every single Big Ten school's sports bar and watch a game with fans from those schools. And so he was making the case that actually Colorado wouldn't be a bad expansion option because of the market and the fact that you already had tons of Big Ten alumni in Colorado.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that the alumni are there. I guess this goes back to the whole point about McCartney having to kind of fight to have a part of that market. Is if you bring a Colorado into the Big Ten, does that bring the Big Ten market into Colorado? Does it truly do it? Or are you just constantly fighting to be second tier to the Broncos as that example? That's the whole thing with Rutgers when you brought in a school that was, hey, you bring in Rutgers because you're going to bring in New York. No, you're not. You're bringing in a school from New Jersey, but I kind of think the Giants and the Jets and the Islanders and Rangers and Mets and Yankees and all those.
Oh, nobody likes the Islanders.
Yeah,
let's not go crazy.
But I think all those players are bigger players in the media than what Rutgers brought you, right? So I don't know that's the danger with bringing trying to bring a town in to bring a market in, is that if when you're talking about large markets already have a lot of different media going on there. And so in Denver, a lot of what we've talked about this whole time is getting the Buffaloes in there doesn't necessarily bring you Denver. It brings you the second tier behind. It brings you the second page of Denver.
Sure, and the expansion thing has changed here already in just a short amount of time between 2010 and now, in the sense of that this idea of gaining market and subscribers based off of cable or dish is changed, and now it's like streaming. And it's so I think if realignment occurs again, and this is even on the table, it's about content. And so if CU's ever going to change out of the Pac-12 to the Big Ten, I think it's imperative that CU actually gets really good at football again, because then the content would be there to actually say, well, a Nebraska-Colorado game on Black Friday or whatever would bring a lot of eyeballs. And it's content the next time around, guys. So when 23 to 25, when a realignment may occur again, it's all about how good you are.
All right. Well, I want to thank all the Redcasters out there that submitted us some mailbag questions on social media, on our GoBigRedcast at Gmail account. Really appreciate that. Kind of going through the list here, I'm trying to tie a couple of similar kind of questions together, and one of them came from Rich Smith, and it's not really so much a question; it's more of a comment. And I guess we've hit on this a couple times, but he goes, "My memories of how poor of sports Colorado players and fans are. I'll never set foot in that stadium ever again." Now, again, that's not a question, Rich, but it's a very good comment. And I think, there is truth to that. We can all think of the 2005 game where I've never seen refs literally have to escort an entire student section out of the game. But, there's other stories and that date back. My grandparents talked about back in the 60s having things happen to their car and all kinds of stuff. So, the point is, why are the fans such jerks when apparently, the Broncos don't have that?
Yeah, that's curious, though. Like, the Bronco fans aren't known throughout the NFL as being the worst fans or, watch your cars. Or are they? I mean, that's not my perception.
No, I don't think so.
But when it comes to CU, it surprises nobody when you tell somebody a horrible story that happened to you.
Yeah, I thought stoners were supposed to be nice, but I mean, just chill.
It's them rich kids, man. It's them rich kids.
So, anyways, that's
Skip, do you have a take on this?
Rich?
Well, I've been to 4 games at Folsom against Nebraska. As a visitor for 2, let me say. 2, I was grateful enough to be invited as a non-CU.
You're undercover
fan, yeah, in the student section for those games. But yes, sitting in the visitor section once in, I think, 2005, still got crap. Even with my old man dad next to me, it's a thing. I think that's died down over the years, though, given their mediocre success. I've since been to a few games, even with another visiting Oakland Duck fan in their gear, and they got no crap. Oregon beats the crap out of them every year, and they seemed pretty beaten down and over being a CU fan. So
I think it's going to be interesting to see what it's like here in September.
I am very interested as well. Yeah,
I would like to hope that it's actually have an opportunity to have some camaraderie about old Big 8, Big 12 foes, and we talk about old times, and there's not things being thrown at anybody, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks, Rich, there. I hopefully the fans there in Colorado are going to be a little nicer.
I wouldn't count on it.
I wouldn't count on it at all.
Yeah.
But
yeah, they're still not nice at the CSU-CU games. That's for damn
the Redcast
sure.
is going to be out there.
Not nice there.
So Dave, producer Skip, and I, we're all going to be out there for it. So.
If there's no Redcast the following week, you know what happened.
Yeah.
Don't be putting stickers on stuff. Wait a minute. No. Do put stickers on things that you want trashed that are actually CU things.
I'm already changing my license plate. It's all right. On Twitter, coworker Eric, he mentioned how his NUCU memory was thinking Henery's kick sealed the game, and then Sue did Sue things and took the football to the house. I don't remember feeling that much joy in such a short amount of time in my life. Mac, you were at that game.
Yeah.
And there are very few moments at Memorial Stadium where I wish I would have been there when I wasn't, like that. And one of them was, I wasn't there when Eric Crouch caught the pass in 2001, but I wasn't there for the kick.
Yeah.
And I mean, tell me, what was that moment like being in there in the stadium?
Yeah, it was something else. It was the Pelini years, and, 9 wins was our battle cry, but I mean, some of that was on the line. And I remember going with my brother Pat and his son Sean, my godson actually, and God, we took that sack right before the game was on the line, like the one thing you couldn't do. And just the quiet before the storm of a kick, when it matters this much and the pressure's on the line like that. I've never been in the stadium when it's exploded like that, like one play that meant everything. That's something I'll never forget.
Yeah, I was at the game too, Mac, actually. I was in the end zone where that ball came to me, and it was kicked. And, I mean, that was Pelini's first year, and that was for an 8th win, which then we turned into a 9-win season because we beat Clemson in the bowl, right? And so that was an important win for Pelini, I think. And, I mean, that Henery hit a 57-yarder. I mean, it was a pretty extraordinary experience to be in the stadium.
Wow. How about this, boys? Amazing. Hold your breath here on this one. Henery on the year 48 is long, and set it up here and be ready to go in a moment. Senior T.J. O'Leary to snap it. Senior Jake West to put it down. Alex Henery to try to put the Huskers in front with 1:50 left in the game. Ball right on the end. The snap is down. The kick is up. The kick is on its way, and the kick is good! He bangs it in there! 57 yards out of school record to put the Huskers in front 33-31.
That is the kick,
absolutely.
which, and again, you put it all in perspective. That kick is what allowed us to get to that mythical 9 win under Pelini. But it wasn't to win a division, wasn't to win a conference, wasn't to win a big national title or anything like that. So that's kind of, not that it lowers it on the value. It was an unbelievable moment at the time. And it really sealed the first season of Pelini. It really finished that season off well for him. Well, also, one of the memories that we got on social media came from Count Isvan. He talked about that 2000 and 2008 games. He was at both of them, specifically with the 2000 game. He mentioned how they handed out free towels, and he felt like he was chewing on them like Jerry Tarkanian the entire game because the game was so tight there. So that's good to hear, Count. One of the other things that came in the mailbox, this came from Travis May on our Facebook page, and Travis follows us. We know him. He does not like Nebraska. He is an Oregon fan. In fact, he really dislikes Nebraska. And so he
seems an interesting.
He listens to the show,
but okay.
But he highlighted a photo of the kid crying in the 2001 game, Nebraska kid crying, and he had a freeze frame of that from the TV. And I've got to say, I was ecstatic that they showed that kid and not me, because I would have been crying exactly the same way in that stadium. It just wouldn't have looked as good from a 24-year-old. My entire college years, you could have had just GIF after GIF from my college years alone. But yeah.
It is interesting, Honke. How many times, random question, very quick, how many times did you cry after an Oklahoma loss when you were a kid?
Or an adult.
Or an adult.
I mean, I can remember like the game of the century 2, which would have been 86 or 87-ish or whatever. I remember us getting destroyed in 84, 85. We were down 27-0, and I think Jim Scow picked up. It was
84.
Yeah, he picked up a fumble and ran it back in the last minute so that we at least scored, or we'd have been shut out. Those games, you lived and died with those Oklahoma games, and we just didn't do very well in those formative years for me between like 84 and 87. We beat them in 88, the last game against Switzer, and then you move on. Then it became the Colorado games. And when we would lose...
So my question is, how many times did you cry? And again, maybe that's timing, but how many times did you cry after we lost to Colorado?
Oh, that 89 game.
Probably
that
two.
89 game really got to me, because I remember that was one of those games where it felt like the refs were against you and all that. And I remember that one probably stung. 90 stung just because they came back at our own home. I mean,
yep, yeah. It's just every year after we lose to Oklahoma, it's Thanksgiving weekend, I would bawl my eyes out and go shoot baskets and say it's basketball season, because that's the only way I could keep my mind off of it. It hurt me so bad every year.
I remember my brother,
and that's why it's a rivalry to me. I
remember my oldest brother Pat, who I went to the Colorado game when we kicked the field goal, breaking the freezer door on a refrigerator upstairs after we lost Oklahoma because he'd slammed it shut. That didn't end well for him with my folks. As bad as he thought he felt, it got drastically worse.
All right, guys, this has been a great show. I've really enjoyed reminiscing about the CUNU series. Let's get out of here with some parting shots. If you guys could give me your favorite individual moment of Nebraska-Colorado. Honke, let's start with you.
Well, I'm going to save, I'm sure someone else is going to have a kick that they might talk about, so I'm going to save that for someone else. My favorite moment was there was a stretch where Nebraska scored on the first play of the game, like multiple years in a row. Started in 95 with the Amon Green play, but it was a couple years later, and Dan Alexander had a run right up the gut.
Eric Crouch. Dan Alexander's the eye back. He's fumbled on his first carry the past 2 weeks. Not this time, at least so far. And he's got a head of steam. Alexander trying to tiptoe the sideline. He's still on his feet. He might take it. Touchdown, Nebraska. 50 yards on the first carry, and Nebraska in the end zone.
And it's like the most quintessential Dan Alexander kind of play. He just went right up the middle, 80 yards, full speed ahead, and there was some track athlete that was a defensive back for Colorado that could not catch up with him. Or maybe didn't want to try to catch up with him. I don't know. But anyways, this was not a run between the tackles. This was a run between the guards. And it was just right away, boom, 75, 80 yards, Alexander touchdown.
And he fumbled in the end zone, but it didn't matter.
He was in the end zone, all right, so it didn't matter.
That's a Dan Alexander move. All right, Boomer.
Well, this kind of goes back to my opening remarks. It's my favorite whole part of the Nebraska-Colorado rivalry was discovering the whole Mr. Chip phenomenon, and I'm still bitter to this day that darn Heart and Dagger Society lost the Buffalo head or permanently misplaced it. So whichever one of you Heart and Dagger folks are still alive and listening to this podcast, which I'm sure you all are, we're going to find this stupid thing and give it back to us, darn it.
We're coming for you.
There you go.
Excellent. All right, Mac?
Oh, gosh, there's so many to pick from. I'm going to go a little more recent. My favorite Colorado NU moment might just be last year when their linebacker went dirty on 2 a.m. and anchored Frost. And we'll see with the results of that this year, but I fully expect a curb stomping this year, which will replace last year's moment and kind of, as we said before, be the launch pad to the new kind of ascendance of the Husker football program. So I'm calling my shot.
Nice. I like it. Skip.
My favorite moments are from 90 to 99, watching the game at my aunt's house here in Colorado with her husband, who's a Buff fan. So every year there'd be about 60 people, plenty of kegs in the house, no joke. Upstairs one year would be Nebraska. The basement would be CU. And when CU would score, they would be banging on the floors with broom handles and mop handles to make noise upstairs. And when Nebraska would score, would be jumping on the floor to make it noisy downstairs. And then the next year would switch where we'd watch the games. And it made for the most entertaining games every year, as far as rowdiness, and glad to be taking her, my aunt, my godmom, to the game this year.
That sounds great. All right, guys. Great show. Really enjoyed it. Let's call that a Go Big Redcast.
Beat CU. Go Big Red.